Get started. My name's Glen. I am a master's student here at the Chicago School in the DC campus in the Clinical Mental Health Counseling program. And we have a guest speaker with us today from the Trevor Project, Sam Brinton. They are the Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy. And today we're speaking about understanding the dangers of gender identity and sexual orientation change efforts and the need for LGBTQ+ affirming counseling. So as I said, there'll be slides where we won't have time to get to, for example, our biography slides. So that's just really there for reference later if you have any questions about sort of who we are and why we're talking today. And then our faculty sponsor from the Chicago School in DC is Dr. Shauna Moore Reynolds. And there's some information about her and her contact info. The learning objectives are there to reference, but instead, what would be a bit more useful today is an outline. So we're going to start off with some vocabulary and terminology. So we're understanding sort of what we're talking about. We'll do a operational definition of conversion therapy. And then looking at the current forms of conversion therapy, what it looks like today, the harms of conversion therapy, some statistical information, and then Sam will share their story as a survivor of conversion therapy. We'll go over ethical considerations and clinical impacts. We'll finish off with a case study and going over the current policy, what protections there are from conversion therapy and sort of what's going on today, and how to get involved. And then at the very end of the slide deck, there's a resource packet. But before we get too much done, for poll question 1, which I will paste into the chat, how familiar are you with LGBTQ topics? Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of A's, very familiar, a few who are familiar. Okay, great. And then moving on to the next question, how familiar are you with the topics of conversion therapy? Oh, it looks like it's pasting a little bit weird, but there we go. Okay, so mostly familiars and some not familiar. Okay, and moving right along. So the first point that we'll be talking about is our vocab. So what's the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation change efforts and conversion therapy? The umbrella term would be gender identity and sexual orientation change efforts. Sometimes you'll see that in literature with some of the words switched around. So it might be sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts, but it's really talking about the same thing. And so there are formal settings where there's somewhat of a clear one-on-one or group setting. For example, a mental health care provider, healthcare provider, life coach in religious counseling or pastoral counseling, or sort of in a group setting being a conversion therapy camp, like a summer camp, or there's also ex-gay quote-unquote support groups. And this is where conversion therapy really takes place because there's a theoretical process that has very specific goals and a direction. Some informal settings of these change efforts that wouldn't necessarily be considered conversion therapy would be, for example, from parents or caregivers, friends, other relatives, teachers, sports coaches, etc., really in someone's social network and within their cultural experience. It wouldn't really be referred to as conversion therapy because it's not a clear process. It's a bit more of a hodgepodge of comments being made for parents. Sometimes that can look like punishments for wearing certain clothes or saying certain things or liking certain things. Though there could be clear goals and directions on the perspective of the person who's doing the change efforts. So a parent might have a clear goal of, I don't want my child to be gay, bi, transgender, but it's not really a clear process. They don't have a theoretical framework that they're working from. So sort of our operational definition of conversion therapy, the goals would be to attempt to change a client's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Or other times it's to reduce or eliminate certain behaviors, ideations, and self-concept. So in some settings, it might look like telling a client that, oh, I can make you not gay. Or it might be telling a client, well, instead of trying to make you not gay, let's try and influence some opposite sex attractions. or sort of a similar theory applied to gender identity of instead of necessarily reducing and eliminating on one set of factors, it might be focused on just increasing one. And so that's where it gets a little bit blurry sometimes on is someone practicing conversion therapy or not if they're not trying to tamp down but just replace. And the answer is yes, it is still conversion therapy. And looking at our history, there were psychological forms of conversion therapy that have been practiced in the US since the early 1890s. So it's been around for a while. This was around the time that homosexuality, the term that they used, was deemed a mental health disorder. And so that's sort of where this comes from, sort of treatment practices for a disorder at the time that we still see practiced today, but sometimes in different settings, in different ways. And clinicians who use or support conversion therapy will often claim that it's part of treatment of sexual addictions. Well, being gay or being transgender is not a sexual addiction. It's sort of, if you know anything about sexual identity, you know it's not an addiction, it's who someone is, and there's within their self-concept, and it's a way of interacting and loving other people. Clinicians might also claim that it's to help clients explore quote unquote sexual fluidity. That's kind of co-opting the term, because when we think about sexuality, we think about it in a fluid spectrum with a lot of different permutations and expressions. But what these clinicians are talking about is what I mentioned earlier of sexual fluidity kind of being like, well, so you say that you're having some unwanted same-sex attractions. Let's look into fluidity of opposite sex attractions when that client doesn't really have opposite sex attractions. Other times clinicians will claim that therapy is responding to clients who, as I just said, struggle with unwanted same-sex attractions or gender confusion. And this is really sort of a cultured lens on what does it mean to be LGBTQ. And often it comes from a religious standpoint that is very repressive of sexual and gender minorities. And so what's the reality about conversion therapy? As I was mentioning, it's based on a belief that any sexual orientation other than heterosexual, or gender identity other than cisgender, or gender expression other than binary and cisgender normative is a form of mental illness that needs treatment. So we know that that's not accurate, that's not right. As I was saying, it's culture bound, it's often based on religion, and it's not based on science. The goals of conversion therapy are to have the client act, present, and self-conceptualize as heterosexual, cisgender, and cisnormative. Conversion therapy has been proven by various studies to be ineffective at reaching those specific goals. Sexual orientation and gender identity can't be changed and also can't be created. And then conversion therapy has also been found by numerous studies to be inherently dangerous. It leads to increased rates of suicidality, depression, anxiety, and trauma-related disorders. So what are some of the current forms of conversion therapy that we see? Well, one of the most common is talk therapy. Sort of just talking with the client, having them explore some of these ideas and encouraging certain behaviors or self-concepts. There are also two other tools that are often used in conjunction with talk therapy that would be aversion treatments. So for example, inducing nausea, vomiting, or paralysis, providing electric shocks. That goes back a little bit earlier into the history of conversion therapy, but it could still be used today. Or having an individual snap an elastic band around their wrist when the individual, in this case the client, becomes aroused to same-sex erotic images or thoughts. And so sometimes this can be in session where a practitioner of conversion therapy will essentially show certain pornographic type images and then have the client hurt themselves with an elastic band. Or it could be sort of taking that outside of therapy and telling the client, well, just, you know, when you're in the grocery store, when you're in the office, and if you ever have a deviant thought, then just snap that band and it'll condition you to not have that thought. That's actually very harmful. And then non-aversion techniques would be changing thought patterns by reframing desires, redirecting thoughts, or using hypnosis. There are some other names for conversion therapy. The ones that I've bolded are ones that kind of sound like they might not be conversion therapy, but they're conversion therapy hidden by another name. So for example, sexual attraction, fluidity exploration, and therapy. That doesn't really sound necessarily like conversion therapy, but it is. It's using those practices. Unwanted same-sex attraction. If a client comes to us and says that they have unwanted same-sex attraction, it kind of sounds like maybe you're addressing the unwantedness part, but it's conversion therapy. It's about changing someone. Reparative therapy. kind of sounds like repairing someone, but no, it's still conversion therapy. And we use the term conversion therapy because it's converting someone's identity, beliefs, and attitudes. It's not sort of repairing them because nothing's broken. Sexual reorientation efforts, ex-gay ministry, promoting healthy sexuality. That sounds positive, but sometimes it can be used to mean conversion therapy, or gender critical therapy. That kind of sounds like, oh, it's critical of gender, but no, it's critical and negative of being LGBTQ, of specifically having a gender identity and expression that isn't binary and that isn't cisgender. And then here's some other examples, but those, I already went through those, and so you can review those once you download the slide deck. The harms of conversion therapy. A lot of the studies have found that there's an increased risk of suicidality. So from a study from 2020, just last year, that compared about 26,000 youth ages 13 to 24 who self-reported having undergone conversion therapy or not. So that's the two groups, people who have and people who haven't undergone conversion therapy. Those who did undergo conversion therapy were twice as likely to report having seriously considered suicide in the last year, more than twice as likely to have made a suicide attempt in the past year, and more than 3 times as likely to have had multiple suicide attempts. This is our 2020 data. And then moving to our Trevor Project expert, Sam.
Sure, thanks so much, Glenn. So based on that research, we also were able to kind of directly connect what this was in a suicide attempt in the last 12 months. So as you may know, LGBTQ youth seriously consider suicide at 4 to 5 times the rate of a cisgender or heterosexual young person. So there is already a compounding factor, but when conversion therapy occurs, it is prescient. It is in the moment that these suicide attempts are kind of also occurring. So I think it's really important to recognize that all suicide attempts rates are usually extremely low throughout the lifetime of an individual. For an LGBTQ youth who has experienced conversion therapy, 42% of them said they have had a suicide attempt in the last 12 months. That number becomes a skyrocketing 57% if you are limiting the population to trans and non-binary youth who've experienced conversion therapy, with again, 57% having a suicide attempt in the last 12 months, which is, as you can imagine, significantly higher than the average population, which is, again, around maybe 2 to 3%. In terms of the statistics that I want to pull from this, this is all available on our Trevor Project website via our national survey on LGBTQ mental health. But the things that I wanted to make sure to point out is that this is still happening. So 58% of LGBTQ said that someone has still tried to convince them to change their experience. While 10% is going through conversion therapy, nearly 60% didn't necessarily use that word, but said that someone tried to change them from being LGBTQ. Now, we may recognize that because we, as Glenn so expertly said, right, we have a lot of different terms for conversion therapy. If you're a young person, you may not realize that that's what's going on in your life. You may not have words for what is happening, but you know that someone is trying to change you. So the number of real conversion therapy experiences in LGBTQ individuals is somewhere between 10% and this 60%, because in reality, we just don't know where LGBTQ youth are, how they're defining what they're experiencing. We do know that it is harming them. As you can see, youth who attempted suicide compared to those who had not, that there's that double, that 19% to the 8 is, again, a doubling in attempting, if a person has been attempted to change their sexual orientation or gender identity compared to not being that change. So feel free to go to the next slide. It's important to recognize that, as I said before, there is a difference in definition. Change efforts, 60%, but then 10% openly said that they have experienced conversion therapy. Again, you see the doubling effect. So those who have experienced conversion therapy attempted suicide at more than double the rate of those who had not experienced conversion therapy. And because it's really important to recognize that most people think like, oh, this is adults choosing to go through this. One of the more important aspects of our research that was found was that 78% of the young people that we had surveyed found that they had gone through this conversion therapy before the age of 18. So while it is very true that many people experience conversion therapy in college or in other years after they've come out, as young people come out at earlier and earlier stages and your early and earlier ages, we're noticing that conversion therapy is tilting even younger in age. As you may hear, more than 700,000 individuals have experienced conversion therapy, with half of them being youth. As you can see, that number is starting to move from half to maybe up to 3/4 of the young people of survivors of conversion therapy being under age 18. Next slide, please. If there is one thing you take away from this presentation as it relates to the data that I'm going to share, I need you to understand that 1 in 3 survivors of conversion therapy told us that it was a healthcare professional who put them through that conversion therapy. Now, we've used a lot of different terms, but these are young people, that 10% who said they went through conversion therapy. A third of them, 3% of that group, went through conversion therapy from a healthcare professional. So the easiest way to describe that is 3% of youth overall went through conversion therapy from a healthcare professional. But I think the more impactful number for us to remember is 3 out of 10 youth who went through conversion therapy did so from a professional. So while it is, again, predominantly a faith-based practice and predominantly connected to faith-based practices, it's important to recognize that you, as a community of counselors, are not off the hook, quote unquote, right? There is still professionals who are practicing this, and that's why we're talking about this today. Please go on to the next slide.
So here's some more statistical information. 698,000 LGBTQ adults, so this is age ranges 18 to 59 in the US, have received conversion therapy, including around 350,000 LGBTQ plus adults who were subjected to the practices as adolescents. And the research outside of what the Trevor Project has done has found that conversion therapy and gender identity and sexual orientation change efforts is harmful not just to youth, but to everyone regardless of age. Around 16,000 LGBTQ youth, this is ages 13 to 17, will receive conversion therapy from a licensed healthcare professional before they reach the age of 18 in the states that currently do not ban the practice. This is based on data from 2019. And then 10,000 LGBTQ youth adults, again, that same age, or youth, so ages 13 to 17, live in states that ban conversion therapy and have been protected from receiving conversion therapy from a licensed healthcare professional before the age of 18. These bans, however, only apply to minors, so people under the age of 18. And then an estimated 57,000 LGBTQ plus youth across all states will receive conversion therapy from religious or spiritual advisors before they reach the age of 18. So regardless of the setting of conversion therapy, even if it's outside of our own control as mental health care professionals in the healthcare field, it's still happening, and it's still happening in other settings. And we will have clients who come to us with conversion therapy, and we need to know about the various cultural factors. And one of the major ones is religion.
Glen, if you can go back one slide, I just have to highlight to everybody, because this is a hard conversation, but the beautiful glimmer of hope, the reason I can smile in the morning is that third point of 10,000 young people who have been protected, estimated to be protected at least, who would have received conversion therapy but can no longer because of some of the laws that we've worked to end conversion therapy. So while you will have individuals who have received conversion therapy potentially at some point in your practice, it's also really important to know that there will be less of them than there would have been before, because we're working with counselors across the country to make sure that conversion therapy ends up in the dustbin of history. I know that's an advocate, not a scientist viewpoint on this, but I really wanted to make sure to add that little moment of hope for you all.
Some more statistical information: 48% of the LGBTQ adult population lives in states covered by conversion therapy, but the bans are only for minors. The way our policy has been set currently is that bans are only for minors because it's a risk to youth. However, conversion therapy, as we sort of hounded into everyone today, is still a risk for adults. 11% of the LGBTQ adult population lives in states where, and this part is important, a federal judicial circuit court has issued a preliminary injunction to prevent the enforcement of conversion therapy bans. We don't have that percent from this source for LGBTQ youth, but 11% of LGBTQ adult populations live in a state where there is a conversion therapy ban, but the court decided to prevent the enforcement of that ban. And so we're starting to see policy-wise, which Sam will get to later, some reversals of the bans that are happening.
As a moment of this conversation, it won't be very long, but I want you to be prepared that we're about to have a little bit of a tough part of the conversation, although now that I think about it, you all have these tough conversations each and every day. So maybe not that unnormal for all of you. I'm gonna share a little bit of my experience in conversion therapy to help you understand one perspective. As Glenn mentioned, more than 700,000 survivors of conversion therapy. So as a very clear point, this is one of those 700,000 experiences, but hopefully it gives you a flavor of what is potentially still occurring. I come from, you see me there as a, bouncy little ginger child. I come from a very loving family. My family were religious missionaries, so I traveling across the country and across the globe to share the love of God. I come from a very whole family, right? There was a lot of love and support in general because we were the only ones who really would know each other for a long ways away. So it was kind of a system that was disrupted when I accidentally came out. I didn't realize I was doing so because I didn't have the language to come out, but I told my parents of my, attraction to the boy next door, and this was met with absolute physical abuse. Now, to be clear, that physical abuse was not the conversion therapy. Conversion therapy was actually considered the respite from that abuse. While the physical abuse was happening, my parents were looking for an answer. What will help my child live a happy, productive life? I can say that now, obviously. I did not believe that in the moment. But there is this space of, you see in the middle picture, the nerdy child. I was ready to grow and learn and do what I could to be better. And at that time, my parents found conversion therapy. Now, it was easy to find. You could have just Googled how to change your child and found hundreds and hundreds of providers. And let's be very clear, there are still hundreds and hundreds of providers of these types of services. So when I walked into a conversion therapist's office, the first part was disorientation. So I was first told that I was the last gay child left alive. To many of you, you recognize this is unprofessional conduct. To be very clear, all of what I'm about to say is unprofessional conduct, but I'm going to give it to you as I experienced it, so that way you can understand where it was. I was told I was the last child left alive as a gay child because it was trying to isolate me. If I wouldn't tell others, then I wouldn't create a community and I wouldn't find the ability of staying in this quote unquote lifestyle appealing. I understood being alone. As I told you earlier, I was a missionary child, so I understood being the only one who spoke a certain language, looked a certain way in a community. So now I realized that the isolation was now something even from my own family. That support system was being broken down. I was also told that I would have the deadly disease of AIDS running through my body. I'm an 11-year-old child, so I have no concepts of how that disease is spread. But I had lived in South Africa and experienced an AIDS orphanage, so I understood what the disease was. They were transmitting trust. They knew that I would understand pieces of the puzzle, and they were transmitting the trust of that piece to something that I didn't understand. Of course, that also would end with religious trauma, being told that I was now going to hell and that I was an abomination. This was so simple for an 11-year-old, evangelical child to understand, because this was a, to be very clear, an eternal death sentence. The other things were fixable. This was something that would keep me away from the system I had put so much of my life and passion behind, my faith. These were all devastating. I would have multiple suicide attempts throughout conversion therapy because I was a very young child trying to figure out how to stop the pain. This emotional, mental turmoil just kept being compounded. And sadly, that would move into physical pain. I apologize if there it is. My voice cracks when I talk about this sometimes because it is moderately hard to speak about. I would have my hands placed in ice or in heat or even with electroshock, while, as Glenn mentioned before, these images were shown to me. So I would associate the negativity with what I was seeing in the hopes that I would never want to experience that myself. To be very clear, I didn't understand what sex was. This was trying to rewire a child who did not even understand what these experiences were about. I want to be very clear that my mother would be, and my parents, excuse me, would be, just a room away while a therapist was doing all this, hearing my screams, but knowing that they were trying to save their child's life. So I want to be very clear, although what my parents did was wrong and what that therapist did was wrong, I can understand that they were being told that this was a healthy system, right? That this had a, according to our, I would now say opposition, but back at the time, like these scientists who had tried to prove it, who have now recanted their research, to be very clear, there was this idea of like a nearly 100% effective rate. Like your child can be just like the all-American boy. Now, I need to be very clear. These have all been really traumatic experiences while it was happening, but they've had lasting impact. Within literally 10 seconds of my first kiss of the same sex, I puked, which did not end that date well, to make a funny point of a really bad situation. I was so in pain from this experience, I couldn't process what I had experienced. That date did not go well. I did not see that boy again. The follow-up, however, and the positive note is that, as you see in this last image, just last year, I was able to marry the love of my life, an individual who understands that there are parts of me that are really, really hurt, right? Kevin, my partner there in the blue suit, cannot come from behind me to hug me because I have to be able to see an individual coming to me to prepare myself for the potential shock. I still have moments where my body will react physically to what is occurring because I was so young. Those are really hard to untrain. Now, I'm really happy to say I have therapists and counselors that I work with on a day-to-day basis now, not a day-to-day basis, a weekly basis, to protect myself from future harm. But there is depression, anxiety, multiple suicide attempts, a variety of interrelational trauma, and to be very clear, a destruction of the relationship with my family. Although I have forgiven them, and as you hear, I'm trying to move forward, there is so much work to be done that I can't really have as conversational, because when I'm in a room with my parents if I was ever given the opportunity to do so again, it would be extremely triggering. So these are some of the experiences that I have. Glenn, I probably went a little bit over on that, so apologies there. But I hope now you see one of the many experiences that you may hear of. At the Trevor Project, we hear stories like this each and every week. This is not something that just happened in the 1980s. We are still hearing about these kinds of experiences today. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to bring that survivor-based experience to this conversation.
Thank you for sharing, Sam, and for being vulnerable with us today. For time, we do have to move on to the next slide, which is going to ethical considerations. We just heard about Sam's story, sort of returning back to the broader picture here. This is from the ACA Code of Ethics, their core central 5 values. So non-maleficence, avoiding actions that cause harm. Well, as we heard from Sam's particular one case story, but as we know from all the research that we've talked about today, conversion therapy causes harm. As for those of us who are in the counselor's career track, but it's similarly said for other mental health professionals, we're supposed to be avoiding the cause of harm. Conversion therapy causes harm. It doesn't align with this first value. The second value, beneficence, working for the good of the individual and society by promoting mental health and well-being. Well, as we've sort of proved today, conversion therapy does not provide or does not promote mental health and well-being. It does the opposite, looking at justice, treating individuals equitably and fostering fairness and equality. We don't tell straight people and we don't tell cisgender people that your sexuality and your gender identity and your gender expression are either mental illnesses themselves that need treatment or the source of a mental illness that needs treatment. A quick sort of sidestep. Sometimes conversion therapy can look like a mental health professional not saying that being LGBTQ is a mental illness, but that it's the source of a different diagnosis. For example, major depressive disorder. A provider might say, oh, well, you have major depressive disorder or PTSD or generalized anxiety disorder, and the source of it is that you're gay, or the source of it is that you're transgender. That's sort of a way that is morphed to meet the DSM. But as we've talked about in extents today, that's not reflective of the science. Fidelity, honoring commitments and keeping promises, including fulfilling one's responsibility of trust in professional relationships. As Sam mentioned, as a client of their mental health professional who was licensed, I want to make that point very clear. They were a licensed mental health professional. Our clients place a lot of trust in us, a trust in the profession in general, and trust in our license, and trust in that we're being evidence-based, that we're being science-based, that we have their best interests at heart, and that we're not breaking ethical codes. We're not doing a values imposition of ourselves or from sources of oppression in society. And conversion therapy breaks fidelity. It breaks that trust. It's not evidence-based, as we've talked about. It's not science-based. And finalizing with veracity, dealing truthfully with individuals whom counselors come into professional contact. The mental health professional, in Sam's case, to sort of fit the narrative here, as Sam was saying, was telling their parents that, oh, this is going to work. This is going to help your child. That's not following veracity. That's not being truthful to parents. If a parent approaches us as professionals, either expressly wanting conversion therapy or sort of describing that they're doing some change efforts and they want the change efforts to work, and sort of that morphed narrative that I just talked about, using sort of DSM diagnosis terminology and saying, oh, but we need to change their identity, we need to change their expression. That's not veracity. We have to be truthful with the parents and with the clients. What's the evidence? Where's the benefit? What can we do as professionals? And what are we ethically bound to do? I'll go over two different cases where the ACA has made statements. So the first one was in 2017. The ACA Governing Council passed a resolution essentially stating that while conversion therapy, or they were seeing a different use of the term, but this was specifically sexual orientation change efforts, but it would also include gender identity or change efforts, is a serious violation of the ACA Code of Ethics. It's not codified in writing that you cannot practice conversion therapy or change efforts, but it doesn't need to be. It's already in the Code of Ethics. And a major point from this document is that action will be taken against licensed mental health professionals, or in this case, members of the ACA, who practice conversion therapy, refer for conversion therapy, promote conversion therapy. And that's of everyone. That's not just minors. While the laws say minors, the ACA is saying that includes adults. And then the ACA, in 2018, the ACA president then, Dr. Gerard Lawson, testified to the Virginia House of Delegates Committee on Health, Welfare, and Institutions, essentially just stating what was stated by that governing council issue about conversion therapy, but from the point of that conversion therapy causes damage to individuals, and it's not in line with our Code of Ethics. And so a action point for everyone who's attended here today who has access to our slides is to reach out to the current ACA leadership and say, look, what Dr. Lawson did in 2018 was great, but there's still more laws, there's still more efforts to either protect conversion therapy in the courts or to prevent bans on a state-to-state level. We need ACA leadership to once again testify, and particularly with those court hearings and the court's attempts. And so what's the clinical significance of clients' exposure to conversion therapy and change efforts? Well, it leads to long-lasting harms, increased suicidality and risk for depression and anxiety, and conversion therapy is trauma. It creates negative impact on self-concept, relationships, and intimacy. conversion therapy and other gender identity and sexual orientation change efforts experiences. They're traumatic in nature. And experiences and exposure to conversion therapy, but also change efforts outside of a therapeutic relationship or outside of a mental health field can impact our therapeutic relationship with our clients. There's a lot of distrust built because of people's traumatic experiences of conversion therapy. Even if it's not from a licensed mental health provider, it can still impact that relationship if it's from another trusted professional or leader in their community or their social network. Going over some best practices, routinely assess for suicide. That risk, while it might not be as apparent sort of an intake, the risk is still there. And so it's not just oh, I did an assessment, I'm done. It needs to be routinely done. And because this is trauma, it can lead to flashbacks, it can lead to re-traumatization. And so really being careful with suicidality and reassessing as you're seeing your client maybe experience re-traumatization, or if they are having flashbacks. And even if they're not, it's a best practice to continuously assess for suicidality. Another key point here is to ensure that all of your counseling theoretical frameworks and therapies and tools that you're using are trauma informed. If you're focused on cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's not trauma informed, then there's some risk of harm to your clients. So you need to make sure that when you're conceptualizing your case, when you're interacting with your client, that everything is trauma informed and that you're being sensitive to this issue. Include skills and information to protect from active sources of change efforts. So sadly, oftentimes when clients come to us who have experienced conversion therapy or have experienced change efforts, the change efforts likely haven't ended. If they're receiving change efforts from their parents or from other family members, other parts of their social network, or in their cultural experience in society, we need to help to protect them from that and to build skills for that protection. And so one of the ways of doing that is by sort of connecting the clients with LGBTQ affirming media, because as Sam mentioned in their particular case, sometimes conversion therapy practitioners will say, you're the only person left, or parents might say that. And even if they don't, the culture that these clients are living in are telling them as if they are the only person experiencing this or the only person in their social network. But this little sub bullet point here is very key. Just because you're connecting someone with LGBTQ affirming media doesn't mean that it's safe for them to take that media home. So doing a quick assessment of, is this something they can take home? Because if the client takes it home, they hide it under their pillow, the parents rifle through the room and find it, all of a sudden you've created a new source of trauma that is potentially even graver than what they've experienced before. Seek increased training on trauma-informed counseling theories and therapies. Seek LGBTQ plus specific counseling training, and look at the scientist practitioner literature that's out there. Integrate processing the trauma of conversion therapy and change efforts into your therapeutic process, but do that at the pace that the client wants. We don't want to push clients into areas where they're not able to process this trauma yet, because if we push them before they're ready, it can impact their levels of functioning just day to day. And so we don't want to re-traumatize them. That's why being trauma informed is key. But knowing that even if they aren't ready to work on it yet, those experiences are still impacting them and impacting the therapies that you're using, the tools that you're using in your counseling goals. Assess for sources of support and build up new sources of support. If that client doesn't have any support in their social network or in their family, find ways to where they can find that support and advocate in their community, but in a way that, and this gets to the last bullet point, that doesn't disclose information without their consent. So if you're seeing that certain community leaders are really leading a lot of change efforts or that are trying to support conversion therapy, finding creative ways to interact with them and educate them on the harms, but in a way that wouldn't say or make clear to them, oh, you have a client in their community, because that's going to cause increased trauma to that community. This is why I want you to download the slides. Looking at the time, I don't have time to go into detail, but there are links here. If you're in the Chicago school, any of the TSC ed system links are Chicago school specific. If you're outside the Chicago school, you can just copy and paste everything but the link, and you'll find the sources in Google Scholar. There are 2 great sources here for general LGBTQ counseling topics, and then 2 specifically on gender and gender non-conforming counseling topics. An important make that I try to make in any sort of LGBTQ presentation is that general LGBTQ resources are often gay specific, sexuality specific. Sadly, they're often not really as thorough with gender identity and expression. So moving on to our case study, if you've joined us late, or if you weren't able to access the materials beforehand or at the beginning, I'm pasting in the link here. Please go to that link and download the case study. It will be on our slides, but when we get to the question section, I want you to be able to view it on your own screen. If you do have trouble getting to the links, please just let us know in the chat and we'll try to support you. So this is our case study, the case of Julie. Julie is 13 years old, white, male assigned at birth, and a transgender girl. Julie is not out as transgender to anyone other than you, her mental health counselor. Everyone else in Julie's life calls her by her name assigned at birth and refers to Julie as a boy. Julie was referred to you by her school social worker for diagnosis and treatment. The school social worker stated, Julie struggles to make friends, does not participate in class, has recently been skipping class and not turning in homework. Julie does not engage in the counseling process and requires a higher level of care. After a few months working with Julie, you have some more information. Julie lives with her mom, dad, and 3 younger siblings. Julie shared how she's always felt different, and by the age of 5, Julie knew that she wasn't a boy. She felt like a girl trapped in a boy's body. She shares how she always sees herself in the girls and women characters in TV shows and movies, how she would draw herself as a girl when doodling or doing art class from a young age, and how she once asked a friend to call her Julie instead of her name assigned at birth. Julie talked about how she hates her body hair and gets very anxious when she looks in the mirror or has to take her clothes off, and she then sees how her body is changing with puberty. She said she feels like her body is rebelling against her, and she doesn't understand why she just doesn't have a girl's body. She showed you a scar on her leg where she recently tried to shave with her mom's body razor, but cut herself very deep. Julie said her parents and her uncle are very conservative and they do not understand her. She said she has not come out to her parents as transgender because her parents already punish her when she tries to borrow her younger sister's clothes or acts too girly. Julie also says she hears her parents say bad things about LGBTQ plus people and that she hears similar messages at church and Sunday school. Julie's parents are Baptist missionaries. Julie's uncle is a pastor, and the family attends weekly Sunday services at his church. Julie shared that she was diagnosed with depression when she was about 10 years old, and she had a mental health counselor around then. Julie started to cry as she tells you what it was like seeing that first counselor. She said that counselor told her that her parents need her to act normal, to toughen up, and to act like a boy. Julie said the counselor told her no one else is like her, that something is wrong with her, that God made her a boy, so she needs to act like one, and that boys like girls. Julie said her counselor often said, God made Adam and Eve, man and woman, husband and wife. God made you a boy, and God does not make mistakes. Julie said the counselor would start and finish each session reading from the Bible about abominations. Julie said this counselor had her wear a rubber band on her wrist, and every time she felt like she wanted to do something girly, or any time she started to think about wanting to kiss a boy, she had to snap the rubber band hard on her wrist so it hurt, and then pray to God to forgive her for her deviant thoughts. Excuse me. Her parents sent her to this counselor, and she felt like they think she is broken. Julie said that the counselor's attempts to make her normal didn't work. She just learned how to hide herself from other people to avoid punishment, and so her parents wouldn't make her go see that counselor anymore. Julie said that she thought she was all alone in the world and wondered how she could keep going on like this. She said how she doesn't see the point of going to school anymore or doing homework. She said she's broken and doesn't see herself living long enough to go to high school. She shared that while the past counseling stopped and she started acting more boyish, her parents still bully her whenever she slips up. Julie tells you a story about her uncle's church and how her uncle singled her out during a Sunday service to cast the demons out of her. Julie shared another story of an older boy at her church who came out as gay and was disowned and kicked out of the house when he didn't turn back to Jesus and the Bible. In the past 2 months, Julie consistently starts each session saying she wants to socially and medically transition, but she has not told her parents and is afraid of going against God and creation. After doing multiple informal assessments, you are confident Julie is presenting signs and symptoms of gender dysphoria. When you've asked Julie about what she wants, she states she wants to live as a girl, play sports on girls' teams, use the girls' restroom, look like a girl and have a girl's body, and be called Julie by everyone. Julie gets fidgety when she talks about not being able to tell any of this to her parents. She said she's too afraid to tell this to her parents because she knows that way of living is against God, and her parents are close to God. When she talks about wanting to be a girl, she often says, "But that isn't what Jesus wants for me," or a similar comment. She shares that these thoughts and her worries of being kicked out of the house often keep her up at night. In the midst of your last session with Julie, you grow concerned as she expressed thoughts about what it would be like if she didn't wake up the next day. You guide Julie through making a suicide safety plan, but she has already told you she doesn't have any friends she could talk to about this, and all the adults in her life don't want me to be Julie. Julie shared that she can't sleep, she can't focus, and she doesn't feel like eating. She is worried about her parents finding out she is transgender, and at the end of each session tells you, "You can't tell my parents any of this, they'd kick me out." Additionally, the next session will be the beginning of her 7th month seeing you. Until now, you have coded Julie's diagnosis as adjustment disorder with depressed mood. Julie is seeing you through her parents' insurance. I'll just give everyone a few minutes to sit with the case study. Again, if you need that link, it's in the top right-hand corner. And then at about 50, I'll start with the questions. Okay, and as we're wrapping up that pause, when I ask the questions, if you could just unmute yourself and go ahead. We have about 10 minutes left in the presentation, and we'll spend about 5 to 7 minutes on the questions. So starting off with question 1, identify Julie's sources of identity. So I'll walk us through this one, just get us warmed up. And then I might play a professor move and start calling on people for number 2. So some of Julie's sources of identity: she's transgender. She's a transgender girl, male assigned at birth. Her parents are Baptist, and so she may or may not identify as Christian. It didn't say where she grew up regionally, but that would be important to know. And then her age. Also that she's experienced conversion therapy, so she has that part impacting her identity. And also she's white. And so it's important when thinking about conversion therapy, and particularly with LGBTQ issues, think about it from a racially and ethnically sort of intersectional identity perspective, and that there can be layers to experiences of conversion therapy, just as there are layers to experiences of identity. So question number 2, using a biopsychosocial model, identify Julie's primary concerns for counseling. So just kind of to translate that maybe into easier to understand, what are the different factors, looking at sort of biological factors for her concerns in counseling, some psychological factors and some social factors. You don't have to have all those, just let's get the conversation going.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I can definitely address one of them that stuck out to me. Mentioning about her religion, how she grew up in a religion and that her parents are, I believe it was Baptist missionaries. And so I think that would definitely be like one of the concerns as she goes into counseling.
Another one would be just her relationship with her parents, because it appears that way that she's afraid that they might kick her out or she might not have a relationship with them anymore. So just support systems.
Exactly. Thank you, Sundus, and thank you, Tamara. Himaya or Himaya, I thought, were you starting to say something?
No, I was reading the third question, and I can answer that if you like.
Okay, great. Yeah. Perfect.
I think that those are all great components. I don't know about D, that seems a little risky as a clinician. I don't know if you would want to do that right away, but I think the best one would be to develop a relationship and build rapport, because obviously Julie needs a lot of support, and she's not getting it from her family. So as a therapist, you can be that supportive source for her to kind of build confidence in her identity.
Great answer. Sorry, I'm just wanted to insert.
And thank you for being voluntold to answer. I kind of want to poke and prod a bit more. What would some of the treatment goals be on Julie's behalf?
Sure. I'm a student, so I want to kind of start off with that. I'm a second year prac student at the moment. So I would say I'm also part of the LGBTQ community. So I think, like, at least from personal experience and from a clinical perspective, I think the best thing would be to kind of build self-confidence and try to talk about the trauma that she's gone through already with the previous experiences, can kind of like allow her to be more confident in herself with her identity in the therapeutic setting, kind of talking about the positives of it and how to move forward and be more confident in her identity, like setting goals of like little things, like, you know, all the things that was told of her not to be girly, like maybe starting a journal of like the things that she does want to do and want to be, and kind of being mindful and being present of her experience and of like her ideas of who she wants to be rather than the societal pressures, and kind of moving her away from those negative stereotypes. Would be something that I would want to work with in therapy for sure.
Can I also like piggyback off of that? Great answer, by the way. And that just kind of brought up something else, like in my mind for her treatment goals, just kind of like not necessarily like unlearning, because that may be too soon for her, but kind of like all this internalization that she's heard over the years, just kind of helping her like start a conversation about that and allowing her to form her own conclusions and letting her know that these were harmful things that people were saying to her, and just helping her come to terms with all that would definitely be something that I think would be beneficial.
Thank you, Tamara. Yes, really talking about those social factors and how she's getting these messages outside of therapy and how to protect from those messages and process them. I think I saw from Monica in the chat who mentioned physical changes for Julie as puberty advances. And yes, that's an important part of this case with understanding people who are transgender or gender diverse and how puberty is changing her body for her in a way that is causing a lot of distress. And the case mentions how she wants to socially transition and also medically transition, but as it should be kind of obvious, her family likely would not support that. And so assessing how can you help her build support, and if she does have a clear goal of I want to transition and I want to transition now or start transitioning now, but the parents are on a totally different page and they don't even know about any, well, they probably know a little bit, but they're not having these conversations with the clinician. What is our role as counselors to help her with that relationship? Oh, and then looking at the time, we have 3 minutes left. So the good thing is, if you were able to download the case study, you're also able to download the slide deck, so you can come back to this. Sam, could you do like 30 seconds each slide?
I will do our best. So we're not going to get through all the slides. Here's the important part. In 20 states around the country, we have limited what professionals can do with minors in conversion therapy. So we well-defined conversion therapy as these, again, specific directional trying to do change efforts by a professional, a licensed mental health professional in more than 20 states. We have also submitted legislation to work to prevent this type of activity in another 20 states. So 40 states around the country are currently on track working toward ending conversion therapy by licensed mental health professionals. And yes, District of Columbia, taxation without representation, moving on. The next slide. The great part about this work is that although these bills have been moving forward in the fastest LGBT movement in history, we are starting to see some opposition and pushback. The idea of this being a free speech kind of space, that this should not be able to be limited. I think we all recognize where counselors and others may fit into that conversation. However, this lack of the ability to enforce in states like Alabama, Florida, and Georgia are causing a differentiation between practices. Next slide. How do you get involved? Next slide. One more. I'm just gonna get into this part. Okay, great. So if you would like to be engaged in those other 20 states that I mentioned where we're trying to work to end conversion therapy, it is not inappropriate to use your professional relationship. As Glenn mentioned, many have already in your profession and many will continue to do so. So first off, know if your state has a bill under consideration. You can find that in the rest of the slides, which we're not going to get to. You can find the rest of the work of how to connect to find if your state has a law or not, and if it's in effect. If your state or city, let's be very clear, ordinances do work on this area as well, are considering this type of practice, testify and support. As a survivor who consistently testifies, it is so powerful to have mental health professionals there with us. And last but not least, provide that support to those who may be testifying as well. This is building resilience. You talked about a lot of great experiences for Julie. Let's make sure that if Julie is ever put in the position of testifying on these bills, that we know what we're talking about. Glenn, take us home. Let's have the last slide.
So there are slides on how to get involved with the Trevor Project, the ACA. So go to this link, go to the slide, go to this link, talk to the ACA Government Affairs Committee on what they need to be doing as well. If we put pressure on them and educate them, they can better use their influence. There are stories of conversion therapy survivors. If you want to know more about Sam's story, there are 2 links here. And then there are other survivor stories linked as well. I have a list of LGBTQ counseling related resources for legal issues, the ACLU's link, the Transgender Center for Equality, Trans Lifeline. This is a great lifeline support service for a client who might be expressing suicidality, thoughts, behaviors, and if they need a call center outside of times of session. It is time dependent, but they do offer it in English and in Spanish, and it is transgender and gender diverse specific populations. The Trevor Project has various types of crisis hotlines, and then the national survey is listed right here at the link. Other important resources on a national level, also within the ACA, is SAGE. It's spelled differently than a different type of SAGE. There's the SAGE for the elders support, and then this SAGE, there's a link there. ACA SAGE also has the Journal of LGBT Issues and Counseling with 2 links. You can request a free copy if you are a student. And questions. Also, if you want to learn more, contact us for other speaking engagements or for consultation. Our information is listed there. It's also in the slide deck that you're able to download. And thank you for attending today.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming, Sundus.